Hi, everyone. I just got back from a beautiful wedding. Mazel tov, Megan and Jake. And today, the Jewish people are collectively mourning. And so we dedicate tonight's study in memory of the six beautiful souls who were murdered by Hamas, and Hashem should avenge their blood, and Hashem should bring peace right now. One of the slogans that we've become so used to hearing over the past year is bring them home now. We heard that a lot today, various rallies, and we've been hearing that. And slogans in the Jewish people eh, have an interesting relationship. If you grew up before the 1980s, you may remember this slogan, "Let my people go." In the early 1970s, Jews throughout the world staged protests on behalf of the oppressed Jews in the former Soviet Union. And they demanded that the Russian government let the Jewish people go. And the slogan they rallied around was, "Let my people go." The Rebbe spoke about the slogan and pointed out that there was an element that was missing. People seem to have forgotten the end of the verse. The verse is, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." The purpose of the exodus from Egypt wasn't just to gain freedom, but to accept the yoke of the Torah, to perform mitzvot, to have the opportunity to connect to and to serve God. And this wasn't just an argument over correct citation. It was an argument about the general approach. Helping Jews leave Russia was obviously important, but the Rebbe was stressing that the real goal was to enable them to live as Jews. In Russia, they couldn't have a Jewish wedding like we had tonight. They couldn't celebrate a bar mitzvah. And so Jews around the world who fought for their freedom were also responsible to ensure that their liberation would now allow them to observe Jewish life, to celebrate holidays, to give their children a Jewish education. And instead, the Rebbe felt the efforts were focused mainly on physical needs, on housing and employment, which are important. But the ultimate purpose was, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." And the Rebbe felt that was left to the wayside. This actually reminds me of another missing citation, which pertains to the situation in Israel, something I want to get to today. 2 years after the Six-Day War, in the summer of 1969, Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan gave a speech to the IDF that reverberated around the world. In his talk, he shared that he had recently addressed a visiting group of Jewish supporters from abroad, and they had a Q&A session. And during this question and answer session, they asked him many questions on military affairs, on technical matters, lots of other questions. But then Moshe Dayan said came the hardest question in Yiddish. One of the people present turns to him and says, "Mr. Defense Minister," he says in Yiddish, "Was wird sein der Sof?" I'll translate it. He says, "What's going to be?" You see, at that time, Israel was in the midst of the War of Attrition. The War of Attrition began after the Six-Day War, and it lasted around 3 years. During this period, both sides wore each other down through continuous skirmishes, targeted operations. The Egyptian army repeatedly shelled Israeli positions along the Suez Canal. The Jordanian army was bombarding the kibbutzim, the moshavim in the Jordan Valley. And these communities were forced, actually, to live under a total blackout at night to avoid the Jordanian shelling. And during the 17 months of fighting in the War of Attrition, nearly 1,000 Israelis were killed. With this in mind, the American Jewish visitors posed their question: what will be the end of this? What will be? When is this going to end? And Moshe Dayan pointed out that understandably, while everyone really wants to know, it's not just how we will win the war, but more importantly, he said, how will we achieve peace? All the world's greatest powers were focused on solving the crisis in the Middle East. But he said, was it actually feasible? And all of a sudden, in the middle of this address to the IDF, Moshe Dayan suddenly turns into a rabbi. He says the question, what will be, was actually born with the first Jew, our forefather Abraham. God commanded Abraham to go to the land of Israel and promised that it would become his. It seemed that Abraham was expected to conquer the land of 10 nations, yet he was only one. He didn't even have a son. So Abraham turns to God with the eternal Jewish question, what will be? And then God himself reveals himself and reassures Abraham. He says words that will become the slogan of the Jewish people from that day forward. God says, Al Tira, do not fear Abraham. Al Tira, do not fear. And this became the slogan of Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob and Moses and the Jewish people throughout history. Mordechai in the story of Purim. In the next generation, Isaac also faces challenges. Isaac lived in the land of the Philistines, and he dealt with what today we'd call anti-Semitism there. He had disputes with the locals over water sources. Water sources were crucial in the desert. Isaac dug one well, but the Philistines claimed that it was theirs. He dug another well, and again there was a dispute. Life was difficult. But then God appears to Isaac, and what does he say? I am the God of your father Abraham. Al Tira, do not fear. These are the words of Genesis. The same words are later spoken to Jacob. Al Tira, do not fear my servant Jacob. And this phrase becomes the enduring motto of the Jewish people. It is true. Moshe Dayan said that there's a constant anxiety for the fate of the Jewish people. We worry over the physical survival of the Jew. We worry about the spiritual concern that they might assimilate. At the time, for example, there was anxiety about the physical safety of the Jews of Iraq. Today, there's not that many there. And about the spiritual well-being of the Jews of Russia. It's 1969. And there's only one answer to the problem, Dayan said. He said it's unlikely that Israel is going to turn into Switzerland or Scandinavia. The only answer to the question, what will be, he says, is to keep fighting. In a war, the most important thing to remember is this message: do not fear. Al Tira. And turning to the commanders, he concludes, you all know too well that a war can be waged even in the face of difficulties. You can fight even when there isn't enough money, even when there isn't enough manpower, or there isn't enough technological resources. But one thing you cannot do is fight when you are afraid. Al Tira, do not fear my servant Jacob. It's a call not to let fear overwhelm you, because a heavy and prolonged battle awaits you. And those were Moshe Dayan's words. A few weeks later, on Shabbat Parshat Shoftim, the Rebbe held a farbrengen, 1969. It just so happens to be that this week's Torah portion, today, this week's Torah portion is Parshat Shoftim. And the Rebbe, in this Farbrengen, addresses Moshe Dayan's speech. The Rebbe says that a speaker in Israel had said that the first condition for going to war is al tira, is do not fear. But why not? Dayan quoted verses from the Torah that tell us not to fear the enemy. But the Rebbe says he didn't explain why. The enemy is indeed larger than us. The enemy is indeed stronger than us. So why shouldn't we be afraid? The Rebbe pointed out that Dayan missed the second part of the verse. Do not fear them. The verse in this week's Torah portion says, because the Lord your God is with you who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Torah explicitly states that there's no need to fear because God is with you. There's no logical explanation for why we shouldn't be afraid. The only explanation, the Rebbe says, is because the Lord your God is with you. The Rebbe pointed out that some people think faith is only needed within a Jewish context, like for observing Torah, for observing mitzvot, and for everything else, reason and logic should suffice. The Rebbe says the opposite is true. The only way not to be afraid of the many enemies around the Jewish people is by having faith in God. Logically, we have no chance against such large numbers. The only reason we can stand strong is because God is with us. And so tonight, let's not forget the second half of the verse. Today, as enemies attack the Jewish people from all sides, I'd like to share with you this message. The answer is exactly the same. Al tira, do not fear, because the Lord your God is with you. The prophet Isaiah tells us this in this week's Haftarah. No weapon formed against you shall succeed. No weapon of war will destroy the Jewish people, because the creator of the world, because God protects us. And yes, the Jewish people are mourning. So many things in our lives don't make any sense. So often we ask questions that we don't have answers for, and we'll never have answers for. But tonight, the words of the Rebbe reverberate. The words of Moshe Dayan, the words that have uplifted the Jewish people since Abraham. And since then, in every generation, we've said these words. They may not make sense. They may not carry enough in them for us to really understand at this moment. But al tira, do not fear, because the Lord your God is with you. And I bless you as we have 6 beautiful families who are mourning their children. No parent should ever have to sit shiva for a child. They're mourning their children, young souls who were just murdered for being Jewish, taken from the midst of joy, kept in captivity for over 10 months and murdered. And it's tonight when we give comfort, when we are collectively mourning, that we have to once again say this, and say this as strong, as mighty, and as powerful as we can say it to one another. Al tira, do not fear, because the Lord your God is with you. I wish you a beautiful evening.